The royal court of Persia was not a place for whispers that day. It was a theater, and the king was its cruel director. Columns of polished stone stretched high into the shadowed ceiling, but no architecture, no incense, no symbol of order could soften what was about to unfold. At the center sat Cambyses II, son of Cyrus the Great. Where his father had ruled with a reputation for tolerance and justice, the son's gaze burned with something different: suspicion, cruelty, and a hunger to bend men's souls through fear. His throne glittered with gold, but his true power was the dread that seeped into every corner of the hall. Kneeling on the cold floor was Sisamnes, one of Persia's most senior judges. His crime was bribery, an offense against the law he was sworn to uphold. In another empire, a fine or exile might have followed, but this was no ordinary hearing. This was the blood court, and Cambyses would not settle for mere punishment. He wanted a lesson carved into the flesh of the empire itself. The king's voice rang out, measured and merciless. Let the empire see what becomes of those who twist justice. Let him be skinned alive. The words crashed across the chamber like a thunderclap. Nobles gasped. Priests looked to the ground. Even the hardened guards hesitated, for they knew what was to come. But no one dared resist. Cambyses' word was more final than the blade. Sisamnes screamed as he was dragged to the execution space. His robes were ripped from him, leaving his body trembling in the torchlight. Executioners stepped forward with knives glinting like fangs. At the first cut, a sound tore through the hall that silenced every murmur. The shriek of a man as his own flesh was peeled from him. The process was slow, deliberate. The executioners worked from his limbs inward, pulling away strips of skin while he writhed and bled, every nerve lit with fire. The marble floor grew slick with blood. Courtiers turned pale. Some covered their eyes, others dared not even breathe. But Cambyses watched without flinching. His expression was not rage, not disgust, but satisfaction. For him, this was not cruelty. This was order made visible. Piece by piece, Sisamnes was transformed from man to spectacle. He was no longer a judge, no longer even human, just an object lesson, his identity torn away along with his skin. When at last he collapsed, whether alive or mercifully dead, Cambyses gave his second command: preserve it, stretch it across the chair of judgment. The raw hide was scraped, dried, and treated until it became a macabre upholstery. Where once nobles had seen leather and silk, they now saw the ghastly folds of human flesh stretched tight over wood. The throne of law was remade in blood. Days later, the court convened again, all eyes fixed on the figure summoned to sit upon that chair, Sisamnes' own son. His face was pale, his steps reluctant, but the guards forced him forward. He sat upon his father's skin, the weight of the empire pressing down heavier than the corpse beneath him. Cambyses declared, "Now you will judge in your father's place. Remember what covers that seat." The symbolism was undeniable. Justice in Persia was no longer an ideal. It was not a blindfolded goddess, nor a sacred oath. It was flesh and fear. The empire would remember that law itself had a body, and that body could be flayed. Whispers spread across Persia. Of the day the judge was skinned and his hide nailed to the throne. Some called it madness. Others called it divine justice. But to every noble, priest, and governor, the meaning was clear. The king had turned the law into a warning, and the throne itself into a corpse that never stopped screaming. In that moment, Cambyses II transformed his court into something more than a palace of marble and gold. It became a place where the walls held memories of agony, where every decision carried the stench of blood. This was not governance. This was terror ritualized. And for Cambyses, it was only the beginning. The royal court of Cambyses II was not merely a hall of judgment. It was a theater of terror, a place where law was not just written in tablets of stone, but carved directly into the flesh of men. Judge Sisamnes had sat on the king's bench for years, dispensing rulings with the authority of the Persian throne behind him. But beneath his robes of dignity, corruption festered. Bribes whispered into his hands, favors granted to the wealthy, verdicts twisted for gold. To the Persians, this was not just a crime of money. It was a crime against Asha, the divine order of truth and justice itself. In the world of Cambyses, corruption was heresy. When the accusations reached the ears of the king, Cambyses did not see a single dishonest judge. He saw rot spreading through the sacred body of the empire, And so he resolved not only to punish Sisamnes, but to make him a permanent lesson. The trial was swift. Witnesses spoke of his bribes and no one dared defend him. The sentence was delivered in a voice cold as iron. You shall be flayed alive. Your skin shall become the seat of judgment. The word spread through Persepolis like wildfire. By dawn, the court was prepared. Soldiers stood in a ring, torches sputtering against the polished stone walls. At the center, Sisamnes was dragged forward, stripped of his robes, his arms bound tight to a wooden frame. The crowd pressed in, silent, as the executioners stepped forward with their knives. What followed was not a killing. It was a dissection of justice itself. The first cut tore across his back, a crimson line against pale flesh. Sisamnes screamed, his voice bouncing against the marble pillars. The executioners worked with precision, pulling long strips of skin from his body as if unraveling the fabric of corruption itself. His cries rose into shrieks, then into broken sobs, then into hoarse whispers. Each layer peeled back was a message to every man watching. This is what happens when the law itself betrays truth. When at last his body gave out and silence fell, the executioners laid out the sheets of skin. They washed them, stretched them, and nailed them over the wooden frame of his judge's chair. The smell of iron and salt filled the court, mixing with the acrid smoke of burning oil lamps. But Cambyses' cruelty was not yet finished. The king summoned Otanes, the son of the dead judge. The young man's face was pale as marble, his eyes hollow with terror. Cambyses looked down upon him and declared, Your father was a judge who forgot justice. Now you will take his place. And every time you sit to pass judgment, you will sit on the very skin of corruption. Remember, the law must never forget what flesh it is made of. Soldiers forced Otanes into the chair. He lowered himself slowly, his hands trembling, as the dried skin of his father creaked beneath him. His body shivered, but he could not move. Around him, the court was silent, a silence heavier than 1,000 screams. This was no mere punishment, it was transformation. The courtroom itself had become a shrine of horror. Every noble, every scribe, every guard who entered would see the chair of human skin. And no, the king's justice was not abstract. It was carved into the human body. In the days that followed, Persians whispered of the chair with dread. It became a symbol of the empire's merciless demand for honesty. To sit in that chair was to sit in judgment, not only over others, but over oneself. Sisamnes' skin was not only stretched over wood, it was stretched over memory, a reminder that beneath every robe of office was mortal flesh, fragile and corruptible. And Cambyses had ensured that this fragility would never be forgotten. For in Persia, justice was not blind. Justice had eyes, and those eyes were smeared with blood. The skin of Sisamnes still clung to the judge's chair like a second, silent witness. Every time his son, Otanes, sat to dispense justice, the stretched leather cracked faintly beneath him. No one dared mention it, but everyone could hear it. The groan of that human parchment was a reminder that justice in Persia was no longer written in law, it was written in pain. For a while, Cambyses II basked in the fear this spectacle created. No noble, no satrap, no general in his vast court doubted his ruthlessness. To question the king was to gamble with one's very skin. And yet, in that triumph, the seeds of his downfall had already been sown. Whispers began to move like shadows through the corridors of Persepolis and Babylon. Some said the king had gone mad drunk on power, haunted by spirits, cursed by Ahura Mazda for desecrating the sacred offices of justice. Others said he was not mad at all, but merely a god in mortal flesh, reshaping the world through terror. In either case, trust was collapsing. And without trust, even the mightiest empire begins to rot from within. Ancient accounts from Herodotus tell us that Cambyses II grew increasingly unstable after his conquest of Egypt. Where his father, Cyrus the Great, had been revered as a builder of empires, Cambyses became feared as their destroyer. He mocked Egyptian gods, slaughtered sacred animals, and ordered the desecration of holy sites. In one infamous tale, he stabbed the sacred bull Apison act not of strategy, but of rage. In Persia, tales of the skinned judge spread alongside these rumors of Egyptian blasphemies. To the common people, it no longer mattered whether Cambyses ruled with divine favor. He ruled with blood, and blood is a fragile foundation for loyalty. Even his own officials began to fear that his punishments were not about justice at all. Sisamnes had been guilty of corruption, yes, but what about the others? The nobles saw a dangerous pattern. If Cambyses could strip the skin from a judge, what was to stop him from doing the same to a satrap, a general, or even a prince? The court that had once been a place of debate, petitions, and the administration of law was now known in whispers as the Blood Court. Every hearing carried the weight of mortal terror. Cambyses would sit elevated above them all, his gaze sharp, his voice cutting through silence like a blade. The chair of skin became a throne of dread. People avoided looking at it directly, as though to meet its eyeless stare was to invite a curse. And Otanes, forced to serve upon it, became a living emblem of the king's cruelty. Though he dispensed judgment, everyone knew he was no more than a puppet, his every ruling haunted by the shadow of his father's suffering. But fear has a strange effect on men. It silences some, yes, but in others it breeds defiance. Behind closed doors, whispers turned into plans. Could the empire endure this reign of horror? Could Cambyses be challenged? Legends tell that at night, the ghost of Sisamnes walked the marble corridors of the court. Servants claimed to hear the dragging of flayed feet, the low groan of a voice without lips. Guards muttered that sometimes the chair itself shuddered, as though trying to rise. Whether these were real hauntings or the collective guilt of a terrified court, they deepened the psychological torment Cambyses inflicted on his people. The symbolism of the act refused to fade. Instead of silencing corruption, it had created a kingdom consumed by paranoia. Every judge feared accusations, every official feared the king, and every noble feared betrayal. The empire's great machinery of governance slowed under the weight of dread. Justice had not been purified. It had been poisoned. The king himself, once triumphant, began to unravel. Accounts suggest he became erratic, prone to sudden fits of violence and suspicion. He murdered his own brother, Smerdis, in secret, fearing that the younger prince might seize the throne. But this act of fratricide backfired. Because he concealed it, an impostor later claimed to be Smerdis, and many Persians long alienated by Cambyses' madness chose to believe the lie. Thus, the terror Cambyses had crafted in his court spilled out into the empire at large. The foundation of royal power, trust in lineage, trust in divine order, trust in the king's word crumbled. The blood court had not secured his rule. It had hollowed it out. When Cambyses set out from Egypt to crush the false Smerdis, fate intervened. As Herodotus tells us, he wounded himself while mounting his horse, the blade of his own sword cutting into his thigh, striking the very spot where he had once struck the sacred bull. Infection set in, and the king who had ruled through terror found himself powerless against a wound of chance. On his deathbed, Cambyses realized the irony. He had sought to control his empire through fear, to enforce purity through punishment, to immortalize himself through acts of blood. Yet now, far from Persepolis, far from the skin-bound chair that symbolized his justice, he lay broken, his empire already slipping into the hands of another. The chair remained. Otanes continued to serve upon it, and the ghost of Sisamnes, the judge who had been flayed alive for corruption, remained a silent accusation not just against one man, but against an entire empire that had allowed fear to replace justice. For centuries this act lingered as a parable, that when rulers confused cruelty with order, they carved their kingdoms not into stone, but into flesh. And flesh, no matter how tightly stretched, cannot endure forever. The bloodied skin of Sisamnes hung in the royal court like a grotesque banner of truth. Every visitor who entered Cambyses' Hall of Judgment was forced to look at it, not hidden, not buried, but stretched and nailed across the very seat of law. The message was clear. Justice was not divine, nor abstract, nor a system of ideals. In Persia, justice was flesh. It was blood. It was pain. And it was enforced not by gods, but by the cruelty of kings. This single execution was not just punishment, it was propaganda. By skinning a royal judge alive and making his son sit on the flayed leather, Cambyses II turned the court itself into a theater of fear. The younger Otanes, every time he placed himself on that macabre chair, felt the weight of his father's shredded body beneath him. His rulings, however fair or cruel, were whispered about as if Sisamnes' ghost guided them. Did he deliver verdicts out of justice or out of terror? No one could be certain. What was certain, however, was that no Persian official ever forgot the warning. To betray the king was to have your very skin stripped from you and made into law. But history, as always, has layers. While Herodotus preserved this tale in his histories, later traditions debated whether Cambyses' act was true justice or savage tyranny. Some called it an ultimate demonstration of moral order, a king so devoted to honesty that he sacrificed one of his highest judges to preserve it. Others whispered darker interpretations, that Cambyses had slipped into madness, using violence as a spectacle to keep his empire in line. The truth, perhaps, lay somewhere in between. But for the Persians who watched, it mattered little. They saw skins stretched across a throne. They smelled the iron of dried blood. This ritual of flaying was not unique to Persia. Across the ancient world, skin carried symbolic power. Among the Assyrians, defeated kings were sometimes skinned, and their hides nailed to city walls as warnings. In Scythian traditions, warriors took the scalps or flayed skins of enemies as trophies. And even in later centuries, medieval Europe recorded the punishment of flaying for traitors. Yet what set Cambyses' court apart was the merging of execution with governance. The courtroom itself became a mausoleum, a shrine to cruelty, where law was not. Written in ink but in the dermis of the condemned, this haunting symbol spread far beyond Persia. Later Greek writers repeated the story as proof of Eastern despotism, the stereotype of kings who ruled not with wisdom but with terror. Medieval chroniclers adapted it as a moral fable, a lesson to judges who might be tempted by bribes. And painters of the Renaissance, Gerard David most famously, depicted Sisamnes flaying in vivid detail, turning the Persian king's cruelty into a timeless allegory. To this day, museums in Brussels and Bruges house these scenes of skinning, frozen in oil paint, preserving the nightmare of Cambyses' court centuries after the last traces of his empire crumbled. But what of Otanes, the son forced to sit on his father's skin? Here lies the cruelest irony. By making the son inherit not only his father's title but his punishment, Cambyses ensured that the family of Sisamnes would never escape the stain of treachery. Otanes' every judgment was haunted. Did the people trust him more because of his father's fate? Or did they despise him as a puppet, a man bound to a throne of human hide? History leaves us with fragments, but the silence is telling. Otanes became a ghost in the annals of Persia, remembered not for his rulings, but for the blood-soaked chair he sat upon. And what of Cambyses himself? His reign is remembered in shadows, brilliant conquests paired with strange cruelties. After subduing Egypt, stories claim he desecrated sacred temples, mocked Egyptian gods, and executed nobles in fits of paranoia. The skinning of Sisamnes fits this portrait, a king caught between the necessity of law and the madness of tyranny. To his enemies, he was a butcher. To his subjects, a man to be feared more than loved. In the end, Cambyses died suddenly. Some say by accident, others claim by suicide. And his memory became entangled in the larger myths of Persia. Yet his name is forever chained to the blood court, the throne made of skin, and the ghost of Sisamnes. The lesson lingers like a scar. What Cambyses achieved was not simply deterrence, but transformation of justice itself. He showed that in the ancient world, law was not an abstract set of codes, but a living performance, sustained through terror. Skinning a judge alive was not only about one man's corruption, it was about reminding every official that they served at the mercy of the crown. The Persian Empire may have boasted grand palaces, royal inscriptions, and monumental architecture, but beneath it all, the true foundations of power were soaked in flesh. Even today, the story resonates. It forces us to ask, what is justice when enforced by fear? Does cruelty make law stronger, or does it poison it from within? For Cambyses, perhaps, the horror was the point. A judge's skin stretched across a chair did more than punish one man. It ruled over generations, a silent enforcer long after the executioner's knife cooled. And so, the royal who was skinned and displayed lives on in memory. Not Sisamnes himself, but the idea of him. A body turned into law, a reminder that beneath the robes of judges and the crowns of kings, human skin is fragile, corruptible, and punishable. The Persian blood court has faded into history, but its nightmare remains etched in our collective imagination. Justice made of flesh, justice made of fear, justice that still whispers from a throne of skin.